Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
This is a commemoration for Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. How well I remember him and how I wish you could have known him and worked with him, to find a man of humility, a man of genuine greatness, who loved this nation with a holy passion, and who was willing to and did, in fact, give his life that we might move forward. April 3rd, 1968 was a gloomy, stormy, rainy night in Memphis, Tennessee. The chairman of my deacon board came by to pick me up to attend a memorial service for a deacon, Alexander of the Shiloh Baptist Church, who had been one of my closest friends. And on that rainy, stormy night, Turner and I went out to the Shiloh Baptist Church. Storm was raging. Winds were howling, rain falling incessantly, thunder roaring, lightning flashing ominously across the darkened skies. After we left the memorial service, we started home. But somewhere between Shiloh Church and home, Turner and I turned each other, and we reminded each other that we had started out to go by the memorial service and then to go hear Dr. King speak. He was in our town, and he was speaking at Mason Temple, a large auditorium owned by the members of the Church of God in Christ that seated perhaps some 5,000 or 6,000 people. And a little later on, I want to emphasize the role that the black church has played in the freedom movement and the role that it plays even today. And not only was it a dark, gloomy, stormy night in Memphis from the viewpoint of the weather, but it was also an ominous time in Memphis from the viewpoint of racial relations, because there was a strike going on. The sanitation workers of Memphis, men that we call garbage men that we sometimes look down on, and yet who perform a very important function, had been so grievously mistreated, so badly handled, that they had gone on strike. They made very small wages. They had no civil service protection. They had no union representation. They had nobody really to speak for them. And time after time, they had been to the ministers of our city, and we'd gone down to City Hall to intercede for them, but had not accomplished anything. They went to work, and if after they got there it rained, they were sent home and were not given a dime or any credit for having reported to work. Garbage in those days was put out in leaking tin tubs, not these modern things that you see now. And sometimes, if you get a chance to see the picture that was made called "At the River I Stand," you'll see these men walking with big dirty tubs of garbage on their head with the debris overflowing and the juices from the garbage coming down on their clothes. And they were not even given an opportunity to wash up for lunch on the time of the city. When they had ended, nobody provided a place for them to wash up, clean their hands, change their clothes. They had to go as best they could and do that. And in the midst of this, there was a faulty truck. You have perhaps seen the trucks that compact the garbage and push it into small messes and masses. And one day, two of the workers, in an attempt to escape the storm and the rain, had gotten into one of those trucks, and the truck had malfunctioned, and they were crushed to death. And no particular thing was done for the families. And so 1,500 men decided that they would strike, that they would show the city that they did not have to take that kind of treatment. And it was amazing. Day after day, they went down on Main Street. Nobody, no union to supply them with strike wages, nobody to raise money to feed them and their children. And they had the signs that you see on strikers sometimes, a sandwich board in front and in back. And as they walked down the streets of Memphis, the sign did not ask for lower hours or higher wages, but the sign was simple, plain, and straightforward. The sign simply said, "I am a man." A statement. And since I'm a man, I'm entitled to be treated with some dignity, some respect, not as a serf, not as a slave, not as a servant, but I am a man. And day after day they had marched, but the city, led by Mayor Loeb, had refused to yield 1 inch. Mayor Loeb made the declaration, "I'll bring in people to break the strike. I'll never recognize the union. I'll never recognize your grievances as long as you stay out. I know what's best." And in that terrible situation, Jim Lawson, a great apostle of nonviolence, who had been associated with Dr. King in the early days of the movement, called Dr. King and said, "Come over to Memphis and help us." At that point in his life, Dr. King was putting together for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference a movement called the Poor People's March. And down in Marks, Mississippi, they were putting together wagons and mules, and poor people were going to march from Mississippi to Washington to present before the floor of Congress and the President of these United States their just petitions. He was wrapped up, poor people, black and white. He had become convinced that if we could bring together people regardless of their race or their religion, their color, their creed, or their sex, and present a united front in Washington of those who had been ill-advised, left out, and ignored, the poor, the poverty-stricken, those who were the least, the lost, and the left out, that somehow he could again tweak the conscience of America to become concerned about economic conditions. And in this climatic moment of his life, Dr. Lawson said, "Please drop that and come over to Memphis and help these men who don't seem to have anything but a little faith that somehow things will be better." And Martin King left preparation for the Poor People's March, left the thing that he was working so hard on, and came to Memphis to help sanitation workers live a better life. And on this night at Mason Temple, he was to make the address. He was weary. He was physically tired. His mind was worn. The papers were saying that he had lost his leadership ability. because a week before that he had attempted to lead a march and it had been disrupted by violence. And the papers were quick to seize on the fact that King could no longer command the attention of the people, that his philosophy was outmoded and ill-founded, that he was a lost leader, that this man whom the papers called a wolf in sheep's clothing was now a non-entity and had been relegated to those who had no influence. He read these papers. He knew the struggle that he was making. He knew the sacrifice and the privation. He recognized that he'd been to jail over and over again, some 39 times. And my brothers and my sisters, I cannot tell you how much courage it took. I've watched Dr. King being arrested, seen his arm pull up behind his back, pushed down on the car, not resisting, willing to put his life on the line, believing that there is a God who rules above. And somehow, because of the strength of his character, America had seen enormous changes. And now, tired, weary, abused, lied on, talked about, mistreated, he was called on once again to give all that he had. And so Turner and I went back to Mason Temple, and I wish I could really have the words to describe the somber feeling. A tin roof, and you could hear the rain falling. Every time the door opened, it appeared that the wind would take it off its hinges. Thunders roaring like 1,000 hungry lions. Looking out of the brown stained glass windows, zigzag fingers of lightning playing a nimble game of hide and seek. And yet, on that dark night, that stormy night, there were more than 3,000 people gathered to hear Dr. King. Rev. Abernathy and his group had gone down because Dr. King said, I just can't speak tonight. I'm tired and I'm weary. I'm worn out. Go down, Ralph, and speak to the crowd. But when Ralph got there, he recognized that those people had come to hear Martin Luther King. And so they called him. He got up out of his bed, dressed, and came down to Mason Temple. And he spoke that night with more eloquence, more pathos, more passion, I think, than I've ever heard him speak. I had heard him speak all across this nation. I was with him at Brown Chapel in Selma, Alabama, and isn't it strange how the names of these churches roll out? Ebenezer in Atlanta, West Hunter Street in Atlanta, Dexter Avenue and First Baptist in Montgomery. During the time of the Montgomery boycott, every month, the people of Montgomery every week met in somebody's church and got the encouragement and the enthusiasm to keep marching until victory was won. Abyssinia, New York City, Concord in Brooklyn, all of these great churches, Wheat Street in Atlanta, 16th Street Baptist Church where the bomb was set off. These were some of the places that I heard Dr. King. Riverside Church, in great cathedrals and small meeting rooms. But never had I heard him speak with more pathos and passion than I did on the night of April 3rd, 1968. He talked more about his own death and mortality. He even talked about the time that he was in Harlem signing a book, and a deranged woman stuck a lead opener in his chest, stabbed him. They rushed him to the hospital. A day or two later, the doctor said, if Martin King Jr. had so much as sneezed, he would have died. And Dr. King talked about it that night. He said that he had visits from heads of government, letters from kings, visits from governors and senators, presidents of universities. But the thing that struck him more than anything was a letter that read somewhat like this: Dear Dr. King, I'm 11 years old. I'm a white girl. I live in Alabama. I read if you had so much as sneezed, you would have died. And Dr. King, I just wrote to tell you, I'm glad you didn't sneeze. And he took that as a tribute to the awakening of that conscience in America that this could be a better world. I remember as he talked about his desire to live, and when he finished that night and went to his seat for one of the few times in my acquaintance with him, the tears were literally rolling down his cheeks, and he wheeled and began to quote the words of what I think was his favorite song, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." He never finished. He sat down, and grown men were weeping like children. And then we erupted in a great roar of approval. And little did I know that before 24 hours had passed, he would be dead. The cowardly assassin would put a bullet through his body. I had no way of knowing, and I've often wondered, Julian, if Dr. King had some premonition that perhaps this was his last speech on this earth. It was not what we call a prepared speech. He had dealt with so much. And I remember very vividly that he talked about dark and difficult days ahead. And I think about that quite often because that night I wanted to say, "Doc, you've done so much. NAACP and Roy Wilkins and Thurgood Marshall and Whitney and all have done so much, and we've come so far." And you were talking about here in 1968, we've eliminated a lot of things. We've had a Voting Rights Act. We've heard a great president speak from the television, "We shall overcome." And you're talking about dark and difficult days ahead. I'm Ben Hooks. I'm sitting as a judge. We've got members of the city council. Little did I know how prophetically true Martin was. And just for a moment or two, think about some of the things that we've faced since 1968. I could stand here all night and talk about the difficult days. I could talk about the Barkey and the Funes cases where students tried to knock down the things that had been done to make sure that minorities had an opportunity. Benjamin Mays said that he who starts behind in the race of life must forever remain behind unless those in front run more slowly or those behind run faster. And so the courts had fashioned a remedy. This great university, with all of its greatness and all of its tradition and history, had never admitted a black student. And when some feeble efforts were made to make sure that blacks could become a part of this student body, in the great Commonwealth of Virginia, there were students who said, "That's reverse discrimination. We're not satisfied with 95% of the seats, we want them all." And how we had to go back to the Congress to mitigate the effects of those iniquitous cases. I remember them catching a picture of a police beating Rodney King almost to death on the roadside and then denying it. But thank God there was somebody with a video camera who caught it. And the riots broke out in Los Angeles, dark and difficult days. Down in Florida, in Miami, a young black man riding a motorcycle was beat to death by policemen with a club, and they lied officially and said he had run into a tree. And the autopsy report said there's no way one tree could put that many licks on anybody's head. Dark and difficult days. And we were having troubles in South Africa. Mandela was in jail. People were being killed. Dark and difficult days. And in the black community, it seemed that somehow we had made some progress, but had forgotten where we had come from. And the number of babies having babies was increasing. There was a deterioration in the black family. We were forgetting the hard struggle, how many tears had been shed. And then there came the renewed cry of hating white folk because they were white, because they had blonde hair and blue eyes. We were forgetting that the struggle had not been completed, except there were some whites all the way back to 1619 who'd been a part of the struggle. There was a John Brown. There was a Wendell Lloyd Garrison. There was an Abraham Lincoln. There were those put their very lives on the line. And since I have left being the NAACP, I've had a chance to do some research. I didn't get a chance to do much research at the NAACP. I had to move instantaneously. But I have done a lot of study. I've been in the library, and I discovered that most of the people here didn't have a thing to do with how they got here. When they woke up, they were black, they were white, they were male, they were female. So if you hate me because I'm black, if I hate you because you're white, then I hate what God has done. And I can't afford to do that. And so I can still sing, black and white together, we shall overcome someday. And to those white friends who wish to walk with us, I say, come go with us and let us get to that magic city set on the hill. And if you don't want to go, then I can invite you to go where the devil lives, because the struggle is on. And so, my brothers and my sisters, we have to recognize that we've had some dark and difficult days, and Ronald Reagan became president. I'm not going to talk much about him since he's sick, but you remember some of the things he did. And one thing I can say about Reagan, whenever he had on that big smile and turned his left side to the camera, a big lie was surely on his way. Then we had Clarence Thomas, born from the womb of affirmative action, nursed at the breast of affirmative action. There he's been roasted and wrapped in the lap of affirmative action. And yet, on the Supreme Court, he tries to fight the very thing that made him great. And every now and then he finds 4 other justices to go along with him. And I sometimes think if you took their brains collectively and put them in the head of a bird, that bird would fly backward forever and ever and ever. We have had some dark and difficult days. But tonight, I'm glad that Dr. King, a Baptist preacher, who understood the freedom march of the church, who knew about those early pioneers, who were willing to say, before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. They did not own their bodies. They did not own the clothes that they had on. But before they would yield their mind and their soul to the master, to the overseer, they said, I'll be buried in my grave. Go home and be at peace with my God. Dark and difficult days. And then some black folk went half nutty and would go around saying that things are worse than they ever were. I was sitting one day at the Peabody Hotel. That's where the Delta began. You ought to come there sometime. The ducks march in order. They blow a trumpet and 8 ducks march in. They swim around for half hour. They blow another trumpet and they shake themselves and march out. Got more sense than some adult humans that I know. And somebody bought my dinner, so I had a filet mignon, medium, and Caesar salad. I was a very grown man before I knew what Caesar salad was. Then I told them on the menu, you got baked Alaska, get that ready for me. I didn't lose my head, though. I still had my Diet Coke to go along with all of this. And sitting there in the lobby of the Peabody Hotel, my friend looked at me and said, Hooks, things are worse than they ever were. I said, boy, you need another hole in your head. No wonder your children are crazy. If you are, how can they help but be crazy? Here we are in the Peabody Hotel having dinner in the lobby, got white waiters waiting on us, and that was a time that the only way we'd be in the Peabody was to be on the north end of a southbound mop or broom, and we're sitting here eating and enjoying ourselves. Are you saying that Martin King lived and died in vain, that all the work of the NAACP was a waste of time, that Thurgood Marshall and Adam Powell and Mary McLeod Bethune and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and John Brown died in vain? Are you saying that Julian Bond and Snick and all of these people who gave their very last drop of energy to move us forward, that is all in vain. You have to be crazy. No wonder your son puts on his pants and has it hanging down behind his behind and his cap on backward and doesn't know where he's going, because you are telling him that it's all in vain. I tell you, we've come a long way and we ought to celebrate, but don't forget, we still have a long way to go. But I'm glad that Dr. King didn't leave us in the gloom of dark and difficult days. But at the end of that speech, he went back into the beautiful imagery of the Old Testament and caught Moses on the lonely plains of Moab going into Pisgah. And God showed him the promised land and said, though you won't get there, the folk you lead will make it. And on that last speech that Martin ever made in this world, we call it now the mountaintop speech. He said, I've been to the mountaintop. I may not make it there with you, but I'm sure you'll make it over into the promised land. And tonight, I rest on the promise, the hope, and the dream that America one day will raise up and be the nation that it ought to be. I've seen a lot of changes. In my hometown of Memphis, we have Phyllis and Metropolitan Interfaith Association, where the churches, black and white, have come together. An humble beginning just a few years ago, but today they handle more than $22 million and feed 20,000 homeless and have meals on wheels and shelters for the abused and neglected. We have the Shelby County Interfaith Association, an amalgamation of churches that are putting together money to help minorities start business enterprises. We have a Faith and Hope Healing Center, where people who cannot qualify for regular care, Dr. Reverend Morris opens the doors for the poor and the indigent and says to them, come in and receive the best medical treatment. So many things are happening. Black churches are aware of the specter of AIDS and how it's destroying our community. And we're called in conferences on things that we once did not talk about. We're trying to deal with mental health, with the problems of the single and the homeless, with the conditions that affect our lives. And I thank God for this renewed interest, because in the height of the civil rights movement, the church was the only thing that black folk owned and controlled. Therefore, from the church, we had to start our marches. It's no wonder that Claiborne Ball Temple in Memphis was the focal point of the strikes every day. That Mason Temple was a gathering place. That First AME Church and Second Baptist in Los Angeles, where people gathered during the storm, because that black preacher, quite often not able to read his name in boxcar letters in the 1900s and the late 1800s, stood in that pulpit and gave people what it took to make it through another year. Thank God for that legacy. And thank God that Martin King saw the promised land. And I thank him for reminding me that so many wonderful things are happening. A few years ago, Brother Julian, I stood, and you were there, when Bill Clinton was inaugurated as the President of these United States of America. And as I looked around, I saw over in that corner Mike Espy, a young black man, Secretary of Agriculture. I looked over there and saw a beautiful woman, African-American woman, Hazel O'Leary, Secretary of Energy. I looked and saw Ron Brown, Secretary of Commerce, Jess Brown, Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And I said, my God, 4 members of the President's cabinet. Looked in another little place and saw some 38 members of Congress who were African Americans. Looked over and saw Carol Moseley Braun, who at that time was a Democratic senator from the state of Illinois. I said, praise God, from whom all blessings flow. And just shortly after, came to this state, Virginia. Saw Doug Wilder assume the oath of office as governor of this Commonwealth. Saw Bradley in Los Angeles as mayor, Dinkins in New York, Washington in Chicago, all over this nation, Dallas and Houston, Memphis and Birmingham, Atlanta, you name it. We have made tremendous progress. I believe that the day is coming that we're going to see. I know you don't believe me when I tell you, but one day in your lifetime, you'll see a woman as president of these United States of America. That's on its way. Get ready for it, brethren. Back up and square yourself together. It's going to happen. Mine eyes have seen the glory. And thank God that you and I have a part to play. Where do we go from here? You're either a part of the problem or you're a part of the solution. Only you can determine that.